Good morning. Revelation chapter 2, if you got a Bible. Revelation chapter 2. On the screen behind me is a picture of a man named Polycarp. It's not a real picture. He lived 1900 and something years ago. But it's a drawing of Polycarp nonetheless. And I want to tell you as we begin, just by way of introduction, about the man named Polycarp. Revelation 2 contains the first of 7 letters to 7 churches in Asia Minor. One of those is the church at Smyrna. Not the one in Tennessee, other side of the planet. But it's church in Smyrna. And it's not very often, once we get past New Testament times, that we have information about churches in certain parts of the world and information about members of certain churches in certain parts of the world. But we have that at Smyrna. We don't have a whole lot of verses. It's verses 8 through 11 in Revelation 2 that concern the church at Smyrna. In fact, it's not really mentioned anywhere else in the New Testament. Tradition says that Paul visited this place and planted this church on his 3rd missionary journey, but I don't know if that's backed up anywhere else. But we do know about a man named Polycarp who lived in Smyrna at the end of the 1st century and the beginning of the 2nd century. That's important because Polycarp is very well attested as a disciple of John, the very John that you read about in the Bible that writes this book of Revelation. Polycarp studied under John, was probably appointed by John as an overseer or as a bishop in the church at Smyrna. Polycarp conversed with John and other apostles. That's attested very well in early literature as well. And so that's who Polycarp is. He's not the average, ordinary, everyday, run-of-the-mill early Christian in the ancient world. He's somebody of really great importance. I want to tell you about his life, but not so much about his life. I want to tell you about his death. It all begins on February 2nd in the year 156 AD. And so if you think about the timeline, we are not very far. In 156, we are not very far removed from the 1st century world at all. This is very, very early in the life of Christianity. Polycarp was a Christian, very important guy in the city of Smyrna and the church at Smyrna. And he's on the run early February in 156 AD. And by that time, Polycarp has run to his hiding place, but his captors found him. When they showed up at his hiding place out in the hills in February 2nd, 156 AD, Polycarp makes no attempt to flee at that point. Instead, what he does, when the Roman captors show up, he invites them in and offers them food and drink and asks them for time just to retire to pray for a little while. And for 2 hours, Polycarp has these folks, these captors, his Roman captors in his house, and they're eating and they're drinking, and he is retired to his closet to pray for 2 hours. Eventually, he comes forth from that closet, and the captors have him in captivity, and they begin to go into the city of Smyrna. And along the way, the captors begin to ask him to recant his faith. And once we get into town, into Smyrna, would you please just maybe offer some incense or some sacrifices to the emperor, and we'll be able to let you go. All it's going to take, Polycarp, is for you to recant your faith, offer incense to the emperor, and you can go a free man. Here's what Polycarp said. He said, "For 86 years I've served him, and he has done me no wrong. And so how then can I blaspheme my king who saved me?" And the proconsul answered to him, and he said, "Swear by the genius of Caesar, I have wild beasts, and if you will not change your mind, I will call them to you." And Polycarp, 86 years old, he said, "Bring the beasts." And the proconsul said, "Well, since you make light of the beast, I will have you destroyed by fire unless you change your attitude." And eventually, that's where Polycarp lands, at the stake. And so Polycarp, standing by the stake, said, "O Lord Almighty God, the Father of your Son, Jesus Christ, through whom we've come to know you." 86-year-old Polycarp says, "I thank you for counting me worthy this day and hour of sharing upon the suffering of Christ among the number of your martyrs." To the centurion who was charged with nailing Polycarp to the stake, he said these words, "Leave me the way that I am. He who gives me power to endure the fire will help me to remain in the flames without moving." And so they did not nail Polycarp to the stake that day. The fire was lit, but the wind reportedly drove the flames away from Polycarp. And these are words from an ancient work called the Martyrdom of Polycarp. It says this: "The fire took the shape of a vaulted room. like a ship's sail filled with wind, surrounded the body of the martyr like a wall. And he stood inside it, not as burning flesh, but as bread that is being baked, or as gold and silver being refined in a furnace. And we, onlookers, we smelled a great fragrant aroma, like the scent of incense. Finally, seeing that his body would not burn in the fire, a soldier put an end to his misery with a sword. That's Polycarp, February 2nd, 156 AD. 86 years old. And his attitude facing impending imminent death is bring the beasts. And so I called this sermon, Bring the Beasts. And I want to tell you why. Number one, because that's a very powerful statement from an 86-year-old Polycarp. But number two, how in the world does that kind of death happen to a man like him? I told you very briefly about his life, very briefly about all of his accomplishments, but why would something like that happen to a man like Polycarp? A good man, a faithful man, full of faith, a man who speaks truth, who's obviously very kind and generous with what he has. Why does a man like that face a death like the one that I just described for you? Well, let me tell you about the situation in Smyrna. That's where this church is, and we'll get into Revelation after this. The situation in Smyrna was a very difficult one. Several years, 195 BC to be exact, before Polycarp, a temple to Dea Roma, Rome personified as a goddess. So kind of a pagan idol here. A temple had been built and dedicated in Smyrna to Rome as a goddess. And the city of Smyrna had at that point acquired this reputation of a very patriotic city, very loyal to the Roman Empire. And so that's part of it. That begins in 195 AD. Fast forward to 25 AD, and there's this great competition around the empire among 9 leading cities. There's a temple to be built, a temple to the Emperor Tiberius, and 9 leading cities are competing for the opportunity and the privilege to build that temple. Well, you know, in the Roman Empire, if you're going to win anything with Rome, you've got to be very patriotic, loyal to the empire, loyal to the Caesar, and it's Smyrna, above all, who wins the most patriotic city, most loyal to the empire city, and the privilege of building that temple is granted only to the residents of Smyrna. And so you can imagine that within Smyrna, there's a very deep-seated loyalty to the Roman Empire. They call it a cult. It's the cult of the emperor, the cults of the Roman Empire, of the Caesar, and they took very great pride in their status as leaders of the cult of that empire. And so in that cult, you were expected to offer incense, offer sacrifices to the Caesar, to the emperor. There was one group of people who's exempt from that, and it's the Jews. The Jews are recognized as a long-standing monotheistic group, and so they were not demanded to make these offerings to worship the emperor. Rome knew that they had to be tolerated in that, and so they tolerated them. The recognition also that Christians were essentially a subset of the Jews protected Christians from that persecution for a while. And so while the Christians were viewed as just part of the Jews, they didn't have to offer incense or sacrifice to the emperor of Rome, to Rome itself, in this hotbed of, emperor worship, until some leaders of the synagogue there in Smyrna began to distinguish themselves from the Christians. And at that point, the Christians are no longer recognized there as a subset of the Jews, and they're no longer protected from offering incense to the emperor. That's where we are. Smyrna's famous for its long-standing loyalty to Rome, expressed in a thriving imperial cult there, and some people have betrayed the Christians who live there. At this point in Revelation chapter 2, the church has not accommodated the world yet. At this point in Revelation chapter 2, they are standing firm, they're standing strong, they're not bowing down to Rome, they're not bowing down to the leader of Rome, they're not bowing down to the councils or the emperor. They're not doing that yet. They're in danger of doing that yet. And so the challenge to them is to remain fearless and to remain faithful, to trust and to obey. And so we read in Revelation 2, verse 8, to the angel of the church in Smyrna, write these words, the words of the first and the last who died and came to life. Those would be very comforting words, needed words to the church in Smyrna. He says, I know your tribulation and your poverty, but you're really rich. And the slander of those who say that they are Jews and are not, but are a synagogue of Satan. Satan is accuser, adversary, right? And so you have some in Smyrna, most likely, of Jewish ethnicity, who are saying those Christians are not like us. They're not Jews anymore. Therefore, they should not be protected from offering incense and sacrifice to your emperor. They're not with us anymore. They're no longer monotheistic, worshiping only one God. They say not only do they worship, they also worship Jesus Christ, who they recognize as his son. Not monotheistic anymore. And so they should not be bound by our laws, right? Synagogue of Satan. He says in verse 10, do not fear, though, what you are about to suffer. Behold, the devil's about to throw some of you into prison. You may be tested for 10 days, have tribulation, but be faithful unto death, and I'll give you the crown of life. He who has an ear to hear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. The one who conquers will not be hurt by the second death. Here's the issue. You got a thriving emperor worship situation in Smyrna. You got a group of Christians who used to not be bound by that, but now they are in danger of being bound by that. You got this group of Christians in the church here. Polycarp is there with them. And you got this group of Christians in the church who are standing firm and being faithful, and they're being warned. One day it won't be this easy. One day it's going to be tough. One day you're going to be in danger of accommodating worldly systems and values into your church there. And you got to withstand on that day. And on that day when you withstand inviting worldly systems and values and culture within the church, on that day you will be suffering. That's part of it. Anytime a group of Christians, a church, believes and practices anything that runs against the grain of the major culture in charge, there will be suffering. And I got to tell you, as Christians, we don't have to run against everything in our culture. We don't have to be against everything in our society, but you better believe there are some things that we should be against. Some things that we have to stand for. I'll tell you more about those in a few minutes. But this is why a good man like Polycarp ends up a captor of Rome, threatened with the wild beasts, burned at the stake with a fire that doesn't really burn him, and pierced with a Roman sword. It's not because he was out there doing all these immoral things. It's not because he was running around on his wife. It's not because he was committing all these great sins. It's not because he was doing things that are immoral or unethical. It's because he was a true, kind, generous, loving man who runs against the grain of the culture by saying, I will not bow down to the politics of our day. I will not bow down to the governing authority of our day. I'm not going to offer incense and sacrifice to the emperor. That was his great crime, worshiping Jesus and not Rome. And so that's why he lands on the stake. But it's not just Polycarp. If you were paying attention here, in verses 9 and 10 of Revelation chapter 2, you found at least 4 ways that the church in Smyrna is about to be persecuted. In verse 9, it's poverty. He says, I know your poverty. And that's probably because people around town have decided to reject the businesses and the wares and the goods of the Christians. And they may even kick them out of their guilds and their groups and their unions, and they kick them out. And so their goods are no longer bought. They can't provide for their families, and so they wind up in poverty. It's not just that. In verse 9, you're being slandered. People are talking about you because you don't bow down and worship Rome and worship the emperor and worship the empire like everybody else does. You're talked about, and it will even land you, verse 10, it'll land you in prison. And by the time you're in prison, you know where this is going to go in the Roman Empire. You're going to be in prison there, and you're going to be tortured there, and it's going to be a dreadful existence for you there, tribulation. is what he says, and eventually that may result in your death. In fact, Roman detention would often include torture in an attempt to secure information about the others. And so they would capture somebody like Polycarp, and they would want to know from Polycarp, where in the world are the other Christians? We know y'all are meeting under the cloak of darkness, and it's very secretive, and you're hiding everything you do. Tell us where the Christians are, and we may let you go. But Polycarp's not going to do it. The other Christians would be in danger of doing that, and their call was to be faithful. And in fact, in Revelation 2, verse 10, there's that little phrase, be faithful unto death, and you will receive the crown of life. We, in the Western world and in our church, we have often interpreted that as whenever you become a Christian, just hold out until you finally die as an old man or an old woman. Just hold out, be faithful unto death, faithful until you die. That's not what Revelation 2:10 means, right? He means be faithful. And that means you stand against the empire, and you stand against Rome, and you stand against the emperor worship cult. You stand against it. It will lead to your death. That's where this is going. Right? You were protected from the laws for a while. Now, because of the synagogue of Satan, you are the adversary. You are not protected from those laws anymore. And I got to tell you, it's going to be tough for you. And as they go to Polycarp and say, if you'll just recant your faith and if you'll just offer incense to the emperor, we will let you go. There's the temptation. But you be faithful, knowing that it will lead to your death and you will receive the crown of life. Christians refused to sprinkle the incense on the fire that burned before the emperor's bust right there in town in Smyrna because they recognized that to worship two gods would be idolatry. They would not call Caesar Lord when they recognized that Jesus is their Lord. Their unwillingness to conform to the norms of that society was interpreted by others as a disgraceful, treasonous act of patriotism. Lack of patriotism. And so the accusations of treason and lack of patriotism in the Roman Empire, it did not go well for those who were accused. It often led to death. And that was going to be the fate of many of these Christians. And so in the verses on the screen, we have a repeated call for faithfulness in the book of Revelation. A repeated call for them to remain faithful, to be allegiant, to be loyal, I think is a good word. To be loyal to their God whenever they encountered a temptation to not be loyal. For instance, we've already read verse 10. Look over at verse 13, different church. But he says, I know where you dwell to the church at Pergamum, where Satan's throne is, yet you hold fast my name, and you do not deny my faith, even in the days of Antipas, my faithful witness, who was killed among you where Satan dwells. In verse 19, same chapter, I know your works, Thyatira, your love, your faith, your service, your patient endurance, that your latter works exceed the first, that faith and patient endurance. Those are the themes that are repeated over and over and over again. The church in the ancient world, they were going to encounter Babylon in a variety of ways. And it would bring all kinds of stress and all kinds of oppositions in the way of the Lamb, but their call was to be faithfully loyal and pledge their allegiance to the Lamb, not to Rome. Those stressors in the church came from the outside, in Rome, and their persecutors, and many times those stressors came from within. More about that later. Now, what about these death texts? What about this? Be faithful unto death. Well, what about the guy over in Pergamum who has already been killed there because of his faith? What about these death texts? If you're like me, and I don't know if you are or not, but I'll just tell you what I'm like here. When I read about, your faith could cause you to die. Or when I read about this fellow over in Pergamum who actually did die for his faith, and when I read about Polycarp who died as a martyr for his faith, my first thought is let's just pass over that one. Because that kind of thing doesn't happen around here. We're in the Bible Belt. Most people we know are Christians. Most of the people that we deal with, they believe in God on some level. And so my first thought is, let's just pass over the death text, faithful unto death, and the danger text, and the suffering, and the persecution text, because we don't face those challenges here in the Bible Belt. I've not faced a wild beast, and I've not had the opportunity to say, bring the beast. I've not faced the burning at the stake or the sword to the heart. Hadn't faced any of that. My guess is you hadn't either. And so what do we do when we read about Polycarp? And what do we do when we read about these folks who are dying in the ancient world simply because of their faith and their suffering? What do? Well, maybe, and it's hard to do, but maybe we ask ourselves some what-if questions. And it's very hard to get an answer on these, but what if? What if Christianity gets hard? What if it were really difficult to live out my faith in my daily life? When I go to work, when I go to school, when I talk to people, what if it were really hard to live out my faith? Good question. What do? What if it becomes illegal? What if it becomes illegal to live out our faith? What do? Do you keep going to church? Do you profess faith? What if? It's hard. What if it's illegal? What if other Christians are accommodating the world in the church? What then? What if we're in danger of incorporating worldly values, worldly systems, worldly thoughts into an upside-down kingdom of the church? What do we do then? What if it's hard? What if it's against the grain? I got to tell you that the gospel must provoke the world's opposition. It has to. If we admit that we're humans and we miss the mark and we sin, it will provoke the world's opposition if we insist that there is right and there is wrong in the world. If we insist that there are good things, objectively good things about following Jesus and objectively evil things in the world, then it will provoke opposition. What about when God's grace and mercy and kindness and love falls upon those that we deem unworthy of that love and grace and mercy and kindness from God? That's tough. What about the moral standards that we attempt to live by? The honesty, chastity before marriage, fidelity after marriage, contentment in life, not coveting what everybody else has, self-control and self-sacrifice instead of selfishness and being led by our selfish desires. That's tough. You stand for those things in this world. Sometimes you stand for those things in the church, and you face opposition from without and from within. And so the tendency then may be, within the church even, to dilute the gospel and to lower the standards in order to not offend anybody. And so we end up sometimes preaching and teaching only what we already agree with. And I want to tell you this morning, that's dangerous. If all I ever get in church is what I already agree with, if my thoughts are never challenged, if I'm never pushed, then what good is it? That's good. I get it. It's good to be comforted in what we believe, and truth is truth regardless of when it's been preached. But preaching and teaching what I only agree with all the time can lead to a dangerous road. The highest call of Christianity is to love one another and even love our enemies, and that's tough. That is hard. That requires great loyalty and faithfulness and allegiance to the Lord, and it is not always popular. And so the church at Smyrna is warned by Jesus himself, things are not always going to be easy for you. And I think it's good for us to be warned at times that things may not always be easy for us. Whether it's opposition from the world outside, whether it's opposition from Christians inside, standing up for following Jesus can be tough. Here's how it happens in the life of Paul. An uncompromising Christian will, at some level, always, I think, be a suffering Christian. And so in 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verses 23 to 27, Paul talks about his extensive sufferings, shipwrecks, homelessness, sleeplessness, no food, no drinks, being beaten all the time, several times, simply because he won't stop talking about Jesus. Would have been easy for Paul to go along with the empire, and would have been easy for Polycarp to go along with the empire, and it's just recanting my faith, and it's just offering a little incense. And Paul, if you would just stop talking about Jesus so much and stop planting the churches and stop encouraging the Christians, you wouldn't go hungry, you wouldn't be thirsty, you wouldn't be shipwrecked, you wouldn't be beaten all the time. But Paul said, you know what? I count it an honor to suffer, because in Paul's mind, that makes him more and more like Jesus. In fact, he writes these words in 2 Timothy chapter 3, verse 12, that all, A-L-L, all, everybody who desires to live a godly life will suffer. Everyone who desires to live a godly life will suffer. Why? I've wondered about that. Just trying to live a godly life, and in this part of the world, that means a lot of different things. But if I'm just trying to live a godly life, why would I suffer? Because some of the things that Jesus stands for are not popular in the world. The truth that Jesus stands for and calls us to be loyal to is oftentimes not popular in the world. Sometimes it's not even popular among his people. That's why his parables, the Good Samaritan, when the enemy's the hero, didn't sit well with people. That's why when they heard him talk about the prodigal son and heard him talk about filling up the banquet feast with all the outsiders who should not be invited, that's why they grumbled and complained about Jesus eating with the sinners and the tax collectors, and that's why they put him on the cross. And so, yeah, all who desire to live a godly life will suffer, Paul tells Timothy. And he says in Philippians 1:29 that he's happy about that. Granted for the sake of Christ to suffer for his name. That's what he says in Philippians chapter 1. He recognized that complete commitment to the call of Christ will lead to suffering in our lives. The church at Smyrna was about to be faced with it, and they were going to have a decision to make. Will you be loyal to the call of Jesus, as your great church member Polycarp was, or will you give in to the empire? Writing in the midst of a different kind of empire in the 1930s in Germany, a man named Dietrich Bonhoeffer wrote in The Cost of Discipleship that suffering is the badge of a true Christian. The disciple is not above his master, he said, and discipleship means allegiance to the suffering Christ. And it is therefore not at all surprising that Christians should be called upon to suffer. Bonhoeffer stood against Germany, just as Polycarp stood against Rome. Both of them died for it. Polycarp by the sword, Bonhoeffer by hanging. So why would we do that? Why? If it's a life of suffering, it's a life of struggle, if it's a life of sometimes pain, and all who desire to live a godly life will suffer, why in the world would I want to do that? Well, we have some indication why in Revelation chapter 2. If you look there again in verse 8, well, it's because Jesus describes himself as the first and the last, the one who died and came to life. Why be loyal to Jesus when it causes suffering in this world? Well, number one, because death is not the end. In fact, in Scripture, it's when life begins. It's when you wake up and you become the true self you were made to be. In verse 9, it's because Jesus says, I know your tribulation and your poverty. And so why be loyal to Jesus in this world? Why pledge your allegiance ultimately to him and only him? Because he knows our sufferings, because he suffered, and because suffering is on some level the way of Christ. In verse 9, also, it's because what may look like poverty or suffering is actually valuable to God. It's what happens. Suffering is what happens when you lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven and not hold on to them here on earth. In Revelation 2, verse 10, he speaks of the tribulation of being thrown into prison to be tested for 10 days. And so why be loyal to Jesus in this world? Because practicing loyalty to Jesus is a refining fire in our world. It shows me my flaws. It shows me the areas of my life that I'm guarding a bit too closely, maybe. And finally, it's because it's the way to the crown of life, which is probably synonymous with the tree of life. In the letter to Ephesus we talked about last week, it's the way to live, in other words, the kind of life that you and I were created to live. Why be loyal? Because it's the way of Christ. And when we are loyal, when we live faithfully, allegiant, loyally to Jesus in this world, then the church becomes a lampstand. Remember, that's how they're described in Revelation anyway. The church is to be a lampstand, the light of the world. The church is supposed to be a community of people who come together by what we do and who we are and how we live and how we think and what we say are sometimes at odds with the fads and the fashions of the world and by what's popular in our world. And so Polycarp offers his captors in and gives them food and drink and goes and prays for a while and then invites death because he recognizes that's the call of a faithfully allegiant, loyal follower of Jesus. It's us today when we recognize that the church is the kingdom of God, and the kingdom of God is an upside-down kingdom where the principles that we live by, the turning the other cheek, the going the extra mile, the loving our enemies, those principles are upside down, considering the ways of the world. Expectations, habits are different in the church, should be different in the kingdom of God because it's an upside-down kingdom that is not like the world. And when the church is a lampstand and the light of the world and it shines light into the darkness, the church can turn the world upside down, Acts 17, again. And so the church can be a glorious place, full of maybe quiet, unnoticed, courageous lives lived against the grain of our culture or whatever parts of our society run against the grain of Christ. Church is a lampstand, the light of the world, whenever we run against the grain of the culture, because there has to be something different about church. There has to be something different about the community of believers who profess to follow Jesus in a world that maybe doesn't. It's why unity is important in a church, because what does a divided, grumbling, complaining church have to say to a society that's already doing enough grumbling and complaining and has enough division? It's why the church must be the most loving place in town, because what does a hateful church have to say to a world, to a society, to a culture that already has plenty of hate in it? The church is to be a lampstand, a light shining in the darkness of the world. In the words of Jesus, Christians, followers of Christ, are supposed to be salt that preserves what is good and stops the decay in our society. And what good do we do if we've lost our saltiness? The church is supposed to be a place where we shine lights into a dark place, and so the light must go out from here into the world. But that only happens when we decide and declare and commit to living our lives as faithful, loyal disciples who pledge our allegiance ultimately to Jesus. You do that, and you trace it out and figure out where all that leads you in all the areas of your life, and I think you can maybe see why at times that will lead to suffering. It will lead to pain, because turning the other cheek is not a painless endeavor. It will lead to struggle, because going the second mile is a lonely road that a lot of people don't travel down. Bearing one another's burdens means that you hurt along with somebody. It's great to rejoice with those who rejoice, but to weep with those who are weeping is a burden, is a struggle, and it brings some pain into our lives. But the church is supposed to be a lampstand, the light of the world that shines out into the darkness. That happens when we follow Jesus. And when we live according to how he wants us to live, when we listen to his words and live them out in our lives, the church is a lampstand and the light of the world. And so to the church at Smyrna, he says very clearly, things may be okay right now. It will not always be this way. History tells the story of where they did bring in the beasts And there was a group of Christians who faithfully stood in the face of those beasts and said, bring them on. Hard for us to get our minds around that today, maybe. But what if? What if Christianity was really, really hard? Would you still do it? What if it was illegal? Would you still practice it? Well, what if it was not popular? Would you still strive to follow Jesus? Maybe you're here today, and in a world where it's oftentimes not popular, where it is sometimes difficult, where it can be painful and lead to suffering, maybe you want to live that kind of life and begin that kind of journey of following Jesus. And today you want to be baptized into Christ, to have your sins washed away, removing the guilt, being united with his sacrificial, selfless death so that you come up out of that water ready to live a new kind of life. What kind of life? A life where you know I may have to suffer a little bit, may have to sacrifice a bit. I will have to sacrifice a bit, and it may be painful at times, but it is the way of Christ, and we count it a joy to be able to suffer for the name of Christ. Maybe you want to begin that kind of life today.